This is your your professor, and joining us today is a great colleague of mine and a great friend, and an amazing writer, Dr. Jean Braithwaite, who's written this book called "Fat: The Story of My Life with My Body," which is a beautiful and very cerebral and at the same time intimate memoir. And she's also written a book called Chris Ware Conversations, where she explores the intellect and the artwork of a great comics artist, Chris Ware. And she teaches in our program. We're lucky enough to have her. She teaches a variety of things. Her focus is creative nonfiction and graphic literature. So today we're gonna discuss Table of Figures by Brenda Miller, which is a great lyric essay. And I would like to begin by asking Jean if she'd read for us the first couple paragraphs.
I'd be happy to. Thank you for that very kind introduction. Table of Figures, Brenda Miller. Figure 1.1. A girl becomes aware of herself as a girl. She is approximately 5 years old, maybe 6, at the oldest 7. Note the mother instructing this girl that she must now wear a t-shirt while playing in the summertime with the boys on the block. Note the girl's naked torso, her downward gaze onto an expanse of bare flesh, punctuated by 2 flat nipples. Outside, the sun bears down, its heat insistent, but the afternoon breeze a familiar pleasure on this skin. Radiating lines from the girl's face indicate a new source of heat, the first inklings of shame. But also, beneath, within, around that shame, something more complex, a deeper pleasure, the first inklings of power. Figure 2.3. A girl, circa age 10, lying face down on her bed. The chenille bedspread impresses little dots on her face, her bare arms. Note how she has instinctually scooched down to the edge of the mattress, her legs straddling the hard corner. She gives a little sigh, a sigh that's almost a sob, as her body tingles all over, gives way. No one is watching, and yet she feels watched in a way that induces both shame and pleasure, the two distinctly entwined. Note the closed door of the bedroom, the absence of any adults, the room an incandescent secret, a sanctuary.
Thank you. Thank you for that. That was lovely. One of the things that strikes me about this essay is it's just right there in the beginning. We get it right away. It's focus on the body, right? Yes. Which is, in my opinion, can never be written too much about.
That's right. I agree with you. And the coincidence that figure is the word, right? There's that play on words right from the beginning.
Right from the beginning. It's brilliant that way.
Yes.
The body, the focus on the body, because it is so what's the word? So for lack of a better word, primordial. It's the thing that we carry with us from the very beginning. We are body before we are intellect, right?
Yes.
And the great focus on language and what words mean, and what words how words carry associations, and yes. Both of those things between language and body is where I think the essay succeeds the best, or is most evocative, particularly that section later on about the difference between the terms slut and promiscuous, monogamous. Yes. It's brilliant, right? It's brilliant. The scene. Yeah, go ahead. Sorry.
This kind of academic language and academic distinctions.
Mm-hmm. Right.
He's talking about almost the least academic subject there is, at least the way we experience it in our own lives. Our sexuality is usually the last thing we subject to analysis, or this kind of clinical way of talking.
Clinical is the word. I think you got it right there. Clinical is the word, and the specific structure of the essay, which in its general category falls under the lyric essay, right? It's fragmented. It suggests meaning rather than overtly stated. It in this case borrows the language of a different kind of text.
Yes.
Is deliberate too, right?
And you underline this. I assume this is your annotations on the page here.
Yes.
You underline the word note repeatedly, and the word circa.
Right. The diction, right? The jargon that she's using.
Technical.
And clinical and scientific.
Yes.
And tables and charts, and it's so deliberately set up in contrast to the subject.
The juxtaposition of the two very mismatched things.
Right, the messiness of the body and growing up and sexuality and trying to understand all that, and love, right, and romance, makes when you juxtapose it with the structure and the diction of science.
Of course,
it really drives home the challenges of growing up. The challenges in this case specifically of growing up as a woman. Right? And as a sexual being. And right from the get-go, the idea of being, what's it called? Being differentiated, being othered, right? Okay, she's the one who has to wear the shirt.
Yeah, yeah. And I still feel mad that I, in contrast to a man, am not allowed to walk around outside shirtless,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
If I do that, I'm a lawbreaker. If you do that, you're not. And I have been mad about that since age 5 or 6, just like this little girl, and I have not yet ceased to be mad about it.
Yeah, really, I'm with you. I hear you. And not only are you a lawbreaker, but you're also a bunch of other things, right? Because all these assumptions are made about the woman's torso, right? And exposing her torso has all these assumptions being made about her sexuality that are not there about the man, right? It's just his body, just his chest.
And even though the girl doesn't have breasts yet, it's very clear on the top of page 42, punctuated by 2 flat nipples. There's absolutely nothing that distinguishes a 5-year-old girl chest from a 5-year-old boy chest, other than the gender policing.
Right. It's purely cultural.
Yes.
Right. It's purely cultural, and so it begins.
Another thing occurred to me. We were talking about the contrast between individual sexual feelings and clinical language. But of course, there are people who write clinically about sex. There's textbooks on human reproduction and human sexuality and all of that. But those books don't use words like slut. That's not a technical category.
Right. So she's playing around with, right, the whole idea, the whole sort of the discourse of sexuality in a clinical setting. Right. It's just brilliant. Another thing that stands out for me is her honesty. We get the sense that the narrator is being very vulnerable, very open, right? And very kind of honest with herself.
The narrator per se does not identify itself as the girl.
Okay. So I read it like that,
I think that's the natural way to read it, and I'm not saying you're wrong to read it that way, but technically, I mean, the speaking voice here doesn't say I. It's she.
That's true. Hmm.
And that's part of that sort of clinical distancing language too.
Right.
Like a lecturer, talking to a room full of medical students. Here, I'm going to point. See those flat nipples? See that?
Right. Yeah, like this girl is a case study,
Yes,
right?
exactly. Case study, that's perfect. That's the best possible way to put it.
And I want to say that the reason she begins to see herself as a case study is, or one of the reasons, is because she's othered by her mother, right? She's othered by the
Yes.
culture. And then she's further othered at school when the boys call her all those horrible names, and she becomes hyper
Yes.
vigilant about how she moves through the world. She's made to become hyper vigilant,
Yeah.
which I, as an aside, being called the F word every other day in my childhood
Yes.
at school, and can totally like it resonated a lot with me, that idea of being called names, and how then
Yeah.
that forces you inevitably as a form of survival to try and move through the world in such a way where you don't provoke that. At least
Right.
that was my reaction. Some people go the other way and they become more confrontational, but
Yeah, or like deliberately flamboyant to own it on purpose.
right. In both cases, you're becoming hyper aware of the
Yeah.
other, right? And how you're being seen. And that detaches you from yourself, right? If only temporarily, but if that happens temporarily every day, then you end up with an essay like this, right? Where you can write about yourself in the third person. It's a beautiful way of turning lemon into lemonade, right? Creates
The,
beautiful art.
that thing about being called a dog,
Mm-hmm.
that happened to me in junior high also.
Really?
And it was quite common. It was a boy and girl thing that they did in junior high. And girls would do it some too. They would call other girls dogs,
Oh,
but it was
really?
mostly boys. And they would be commenting on which of the girls were attractive, and the unattractive ones were the dogs. But they are really all that discriminating. They would say dog to just about anybody to get a reaction, and as an exercise of masculine power.
I agree. Yes,
And
that's you. You're
it
right.
didn't mind how cruddy looking they themselves were. They were boys, so they could seize this power.
Yeah, and exercise it and feel sort of inhabit it, right? Yeah, if only momentarily, and if only in their heads. But well, the culture was on their side, right? For sure. Um, I want to also point out to my students how she deftly covers a great amount of her. She moves from her childhood to her
Yes.
pretty much present self in a relatively, really concentrated amount
She
of space.
at least to age 47. On page 47, we have a woman alone in her house. She is 47 years old. So that's
Yeah, from 5 to 47
a lot of distance there.
in
A few
in
figures.
1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, about 7 pages, 6.5 to 7 pages.
Oh,
Um,
I thought maybe you were counting the sections.
oh no, although they're also quite limited, of course. But it's a great example to follow about how you can either, well, this is the other way, right? That usually in memoir, what we struggle with as beginning writers or personal writing, personal essays is,
Yeah.
well, I have memory, but how do I get
Yes.
5 pages out of it? How do I get 8 pages out of this thing, right? There's one thing that happened. Here's the other challenge. Here's the other side. I want to cover a long breadth of time in a limited amount of pages. How do I pick and choose, right?
Yes. Yeah.
And she
And
does a great job of really pointing out
that's
those.
the beauty of this. You really get a sense of the life of this specific person, the so-called case study.
Specifically her troubled relationship to To her sexuality, but bigger than that, to her sense of worth, right?
Yes.
I was particularly moved. I thought it was a brilliant move when she talks about the graph. Well, one, when she talks about the father being upset and calling her up, and she feels like, oh, he's angry, so that means I have worth, right?
You're right. On page 44, she is secretly pleased to have been caught. It means she is beautiful. It means they have risked something to be together, her and her 20-year-old lover. And so she must be valuable, worth something.
Right. It's just the first time I read it, it just caught me by surprise. And I already mentioned the clarification of terms, and then the number of fights versus the number of times. Anyway, I'm getting a little like
on page 43, table 4. This is the first section that we get that's labeled something other than figure, because it's about something else. It's her and her dad and their relationship. It's not her relationship to her body. So table 4 on page 43 is the ratio of the number of fights.
Right. Girl has with her father, ranging from clothing she wears, example, sheer halter top that barely covers her breasts, forcing her father to utter the word nipple with such embarrassed force that it startles her for a moment from her blasé teenage countenance, to the number of boys she has kissed. Note steep rise circa age 15 when girl loses her virginity. There's another loaded term that she examines.
You can just about see the slide being flashed up there, and the person taking the pointer. See here, we're the peak on the graph.
Mm-hmm. And that's part of the brilliance of the essay, is that she takes something that, that's so amorphous, and she transforms it into image.
There's like a virtual infographic here, and we're not actually even seeing the chart itself, but just getting the sense of what's behind it in the character's life, I'll call it the story world, for want of a better term.
Mm-hmm. The story world, certainly. And to be able to do that, right, like, is really, it takes a lot of skill. It takes a lot of skill, but it's beautifully done. And I have to say that I've assigned this essay before in previous classes, and we've as a class, we've like we get going and we do a collective list of different kinds of texts that we encounter every day.
Okay, yeah, good.
From menus, restaurant menus, to credit card statements, to, of course, the basics, emails and Facebook posts and all that. And on and on and on, right? Like recipes and receipts and prescriptions, medical prescriptions. And it's amazing what the students have come up with on their own,
Yes.
I had a student write an essay that was in the form of a menu.
Oh yeah, good.
And she, no, it was very interesting.
Are you familiar with the essayist Andrew Monson?
Andrew Monson.
Not Andrew, Ander, A-N-D-E-R.
Oh, no.
M-O-N-S-O-N. He's got some amazing, what Brenda Miller would call hermit crab essays also. Like what form of an index, for instance.
Oh, okay. I'll definitely look at.
I'll loan you my Andrew Monson collection if you're interested. But yeah, he does some amazing things with pushing the form of what can be done. The Harvard outline form, where you
Harvard outline.
You start with Roman numeral 1 and Roman numeral 2 and Roman numeral 3, and then under the Roman numerals you break it down with A, B, C, D, and under the A, B, C, D you break it down with little Arabic numeral 1 and so on. Mm-hmm. Well, he's got another essay in that form.
I'll have to take a look at it.
Yeah, you really should.
Yeah, I'm fascinated by this form of lyrical essay.
Also.
I'm sorry?
Since we've referred to it on this recording, we can put some links up also.
Okay. Yeah, there's it's expansive and intimate and personal and compressed all at the same time, which is a tough thing to do. But
I admire the heck out of it. Memoir. Do you read this as a memoir?
hold on, the audio is a little strange.
Sorry.
I think it's better now. Yeah.
A minute ago, you used the word memoir.
Mm-hmm.
Do you read this piece as a memoir or as a personal?
I do. How do you read it?
I don't. It might be. I mean, I wouldn't think something is amiss if all of this came directly out of Brenda Miller's real life. But I didn't particularly read it that way. The word you used before, case study, I read it more as a case study of a person who may or may not be completely hypothetical.
Okay.
Although in certain respects, this case study girl is characteristic of what women's lives are like in general. And, you know, every girl has to be taught that she is a girl and can't go around topless. And every girl is subjected to some degree of body shaming by boys right around puberty. And, you know, and not every woman winds up single by the age of 47, but plenty do, you know. One of the things I do a lot with students when I'm teaching a mixed genre class is focus on genre sort of intensely, like where are the limits of a genre, and what does it mean for something to be an essay versus something being a poem. When you call this a lyric essay, you're making the claim that it's right on the border with poetry, or that it shares a lot in common with poetry. What if you had encountered this in a collection of fiction? Can you imagine reading it in a collection of fiction, just for the sake of a thought experiment?
I hadn't up until you mentioned it right now, but yeah, especially because it's written in the third person. Yeah. She.
If I encountered this in a book of collected fiction, I wouldn't think, nah, this is an essay. I would totally accept this as a work of fiction. And I would find it to be a convincing and moving piece of fiction.
But, you know, that can be said about a lot of memoirs, right?
Well,
so
maybe.
A lot of them, and let me say which ones I think could pass for fiction, are the ones that have very little to no reflection or analysis, which is the ones that are mostly narrative, right? Which function as you know, a narrator. A first-person narrator, right? In fiction, we have a lot of stories like that with the I, right? Yeah. And if the memoirist is mostly narrating the story, and with very little self-analysis, with very little sort of addressing the reader directly, then a lot of those memoirs could fall into fiction as well. Could they? I mean, could find themselves in fiction anthology without raising any red flags.
You're right, of course. And what the difference boils down to in the case of memoir that is marketed as memoir is basically it's a different kind of contract with the reader. You're assuring the reader, this actually happened. This is from real life.
Yeah.
But what I'm thinking is Brenda Miller is not making that claim about this piece. There's nothing about it to suggest that she is.
Well, that's interesting. Yeah, that's something certainly to consider.
If you found out that Brenda Miller had been happily married since the age of 30, that would falsify this as a memoir, right?
Yes. Oh, but it could still count as
It could
creative
still,
nonfiction as a
yes,
case study of femininity
yes,
or womanhood in
yeah.
America. Or, yeah.
It's, I tell my students all the time when we're like grappling with the question of what makes an essay, that there can be things in an essay that are made up. There can be hypothetical examples inside an essay.
Yes, yes, I've explored that with my students too, certainly. There is a book that I use in my graduate class called "You Can't Make This Stuff Up" by Lee
Yeah,
Gutkin, and
yes,
he really hammers home the other extreme of that, the other side of that, that there can't be made up stuff. That if there is hypotheticals, you have to like tag the reader that it's a hypothetical or an imagined
yes, yeah,
moment. In the end, I tell my students, you know, the line between fiction and nonfiction is not a clear line. It's fuzzy, it's gray. Some people
yes,
are comfortable doing certain things, some writers in nonfiction that other writers may not be comfortable with, right? Like the idea of recreating dialogue, the idea of composite characters,
yes.
stuff like
Or,
that.
or invented hypothetical case studies.
Hmm.
This is an essay about what a female life is like inhabiting a female body and subjected to the cultural pressures and the external gaze upon the female body.
Right,
And
right.
it doesn't make a bit of difference to me whether any of this stuff or none of this stuff, or probably it's somewhere in between, actually happened to Brenda Miller,
Hmm.
the actual person.
Yeah, yeah. Um, I pair this essay with a textbook called "Tell It Slant"
Yes, yes,
by Brenda Miller
yeah,
and Suzanne Paola, and I think in it, if I remember correctly, she mentions the writing of essays in the third person,
uh-huh.
and I think that's why I made the assumption that she was writing about herself, because she writes about writing essays in the third person of
Yes,
herself.
yeah,
But you're right; it works both ways.
yeah,
Its value really is, as most writing, its value doesn't lie so much in the fact that it happened, because
right,
as Lee Gutkin says, no, Vivian Gornick says, you don't get credit for the living. It's what you make of it, you know, what meaning you find in it and you
yeah,
communicate to the reader. That's what's valuable. That's what the reader takes with them. So that, yeah, its value is in the content itself, right? The beauty and the lyricism and the imagery and the truth that it's communicating, right? Beyond the personal experience
yeah.
of the challenges of being a woman inhabiting as you say, you know, a woman's body, given all the cultural pressures
Yeah,
around,
being barked
especially.
at by the boys.
Yes, I can't. I'm thinking, you know, it's weird. I maybe I was in me in high school. I was so into myself, right, and my own stuff that I don't remember. I remember a lot, but I don't remember. I'm sure it happened, but I don't remember the boys being like that with the girls. Um,
I
Again,
remember them
probably because I
here.
was so obsessed with me and what they were calling me, right?
Yes,
Um,
yeah,
I'm
and
sure it happened. I'm sure it happened because, yeah, because I'm sure that McAllen, Texas is not exempt from, you know, all that.
I always sort of thought of it as a kind of a universal experience, but maybe there's a cultural component that I'm not aware of, you know. Maybe
No,
only
no,
boys do this
no.
kind
I think you're right in calling it universal. I mean, if I took a survey in my class, you
of,
know, I imagine
yeah.
a majority of the
Go
women would say, "Yep, that sounds about right."
ahead.
And the majority of the boys would say the same thing. Um, uh, the men, I'm sorry, the majority of the men would say the same
The
thing.
former boys.
Yes, the former boys, yeah. But that's the fun of a creative nonfiction class, right? Is that we get to explore some of that if we
Yeah,
want to. You know, we get to go back as more mature adults
right.
and
Yeah.
and analyze and try to find meaning for ourselves and for the reader, right?
I have a small question.
Mm-hmm.
Most of the things that you underlined on the page or put a star by or whatever, I understood exactly what you were saying or what you were up to. But one thing I didn't, you've got an annotation skeleton in a couple of places on page 42 and 43. What did you mean skeleton?
Oh, I was simply struck by the references to her bones.
Okay.
And I thought there might be something going on there. In the end, I don't know that there was anything going on there. But as I was reading it, I was marking the places where she kept coming back to her bones, her hip bones,
Okay.
and that always, well, it struck me because when I think of bones, I think of death and decay.
Yeah.
But maybe that's not what she was referencing.
Well, it's a structural word also, and I thought you might be talking about the bones of the essay.
I wasn't, but maybe that is what she was going for, you know?
We've got in two senses. The live girl's body and then to Esther.
Hold on. The audio is off a little bit again. Repeat that last sentence. Right, so that's why I had the word, that's why I wrote that margin comment.
Yeah.
But you were saying?
Well, just as the word figure refers both to the girl's body, her live flesh and blood body in the story world, and it refers to this idea of a graphic that's placed into a technical text. So skeleton operates in the same way too. There's the bodily skeleton, and then there's the structure of the essay. These little sections do make up the bones of it, and then what's inside the sections is the meat of it.
That's a very interesting way of reading it. Yeah, most definitely. I know next time I read it, I'll be thinking about that. Well, I think that about wraps it up.
Okay.
Thank you, Braithwaite. I am ever so grateful. Students,
I've enjoyed it so much. Thank you for having me.
yeah, and students, please, when you're considering signing up for classes, keep that name in mind, Braithwaite. You won't be disappointed.
Thank you so much, Jose.